The sky above Khan Younis was already heavy, the afternoon sun striking through a haze of dust and despair. Nasser Hospital, the last functioning public hospital in southern Gaza, stood amid shattered buildings and crumbling lives, a beacon of precarious sanctuary. For months, its walls had held the battered and broken, civilians, families, journalists. And on that Monday, August 25, 2025, it would become a place of unimaginable tragedy. It began with the first strike. Around 10 a.m., with the hospital's corridors packed with exhausted doctors, terrified patients, and a handful of journalists trying to capture the human face of war, the building trembled. A barrage of force landed on the top floor. Chaos ensued. Reuters cameraman Hussam al-Masri raised his camera to film the scene, not expecting his next breath would be his last. Within moments, he and another person were killed. The air, thick with debris, carried the cries of those wounded and the stunned silence of those left alive. In the aftermath, as dust settled into a grim ballet, paramedics and civilians rushed up the staircase, orange-vested first responders, journalists, volunteers, all driven by a single purpose, to save whoever they could. 15 minutes passed like a lifetime. Then the second strike hit, more devastating than the first. A fiery blast engulfed those on the stairs. The wounded, the hopeful, the compassionate, they all fell together. Among the dead, 5 journalists, Hussam al-Masri of Reuters, Mariam Abu Daga, the 33-year-old freelance AP reporter, Mohammed Salameh of Al Jazeera, Moz Abu Taha, freelance photographer, and Ahmad Abu Aziz from Middle East Eye and Quds News Network. Medical staff, wounded civilians, rescuers, all had been shattered in an instant. More than 20 souls were lost, dozens injured. World leaders recoiled. The UN Human Rights Office, speaking from Geneva, issued a plea that echoed across the globe. There needs to be justice, said spokesperson Thamin al-Khitan, pointing out that the sheer number of journalists killed raised alarming questions about whether members of the media were being deliberately targeted. The double tap tactic, hitting a site twice while first responders are present, is widely condemned under international law, let alone when the target is a hospital. Israel's initial response was terse. It expressed deep regret over what it called a tragic mishap and launched an investigation. Military sources asserted they were aiming for a Hamas-placed surveillance camera near the hospital, not the building. They even claimed that 6 of those killed were militants. But the hospital staff, survivors, and footage contradicted that narrative. The victims were rescuers, journalists, and civilians. No evidence was provided to support the camera claim or the militant identification. Inside the hospital, survivors, some injured, some shell-shocked, recounted the horror. An unnamed medic described the second strike. They had just climbed the staircase, bandages in hand, when the ground erupted beneath them. They saw colleagues tossed off the steps, bodies swallowed by smoke. A journalist who had lived through the blast later wrote, "I saw life flash in fragments, faces, cameras, hands reaching for help, falling under rubble." Those words traveled far beyond Gaza. Outside, protests ignited. Across Israel, thousands took to the streets, blocking highways, setting tires ablaze, to demand a ceasefire and the release of hostages still held by Hamas. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, voices rose. Families of hostages, pacifists, everyday citizens, united in grief and exasperation. Global outrage intensified. U.S. President Donald Trump, though brief, admitted he was not happy with what transpired. French President Emmanuel Macron called the strike intolerable. Press freedom advocates, Committee to Protect Journalists, the Foreign Press Association, UNESCO, demanded an impartial investigation and protection for journalists and medical personnel. The UN Secretary-General urged a prompt and impartial inquiry. The WHO highlighted how the attack further crushed Gaza's already crippled healthcare system. In Gaza, amidst collapsing infrastructure and famine, Nasser Hospital had stood as a last refuge, until that day. It had been the only hope for thousands, now reduced to ruins and grief. Among the injured, a photographer who survived recounted, "I'll never stop seeing the faces of my friends falling." He wept as he said it. International law is clear. Hospitals, medical personnel, and media workers are protected entities in armed conflict. Violating those protections could amount to war crimes. The use of double tap strikes, hitting rescuers after the initial blast, is especially egregious. The urgency of accountability reverberated through courts, UN chambers, and newsrooms. Yet, the path to justice is tangled. Israeli military inquiries in the past have closed with no prosecutions or clear outcomes. UN officials warned that this time, faced with such blatant loss of civilian life, of journalism itself, closure without accountability would fuel impunity. In the days that followed, families held impromptu memorials. A cardboard sign reading, "They were just doing their jobs," became a makeshift shrine at a street corner. Candles flickered beneath images of journalists, smiling faces captured before tragedy. Journalistic collectives pledged to continue reporting, their pens defiant against bombing and censorship. One AP editor, voice cracking, spoke at an international virtual vigil. They went there to tell the world what was happening. Instead, they became the story. She held back tears and promised the fallen would not be forgotten, and that the truth they sought to share would survive. In international courts, lawyers and activists began building a case. They hoped to gather eyewitness testimonies, videos, forensic reports, documenting the second strike on evacuees, the identity of victims, the absence of warning, all evidence that could pierce the veil of denial. In Geneva, humanitarian law experts prepared briefs, citing the hospital strike as a potential war crime. Meanwhile, in Gaza, patients walked through cracked floors, medical equipment strewn like toys in a war zone. The few remaining staff, traumatized, fearful, held together the fragments of care. Hope, for now, lay in the words echoed from Geneva to New York: there needs to be justice. Not just as a phrase, but as a demand, one that the world would have to answer.